Welcome to Dark Dreams.
The moon is full and it is dripping with blood.
Now comes Blood Moon Rising magazine.
Original fiction,
Creature features,
nightmarish artwork.
interviews, and other original horror.
Visit bloodmoonrisingmagazine.com and join our rising legion.
The Darkness Beyond by Jamil Nasir. Sunday afternoon, store windows were dark. Stripped of its crowds, downtown looked dirty, worn out, empty. The air was still, and the thunder muttered uneasily between the buildings. Butler McLean, driven from his apartment by the emptiness of TV, walked through a wasteland. When it started to rain, he sheltered under the marquee of a rundown movie theater. He stood for a while watching the rain, breathing the coolness of it. Then he bought a ticket and went in for the last 20 minutes of the kung fu picture that was playing. When it was over, he stayed in his seat to watch the handful of patrons leave. The last to come up the aisle was a woman. She was almost past him when he realized he knew her. He followed her into the foyer. She had her hand on the exit door. "Miss," he said. She turned. "Jean," he said. "You're Jean Bellows." His heart was pounding. "No," she said, and pushed the door open. He followed her onto the sidewalk. "Miss," he called after her. She ignored him. She got into a long black car waiting at the curb. The car pulled away, got lost in the rain. Back at his apartment, he got rid of his wet clothes, toweled his hair, hunted in a closet for a box of old photographs. He shuffled through the box until he found one of a girl in sweatpants and an undershirt, sitting on a desk covered with papers. She looked just the way Butler remembered her, a little younger than the woman in the movie theater. He studied the photograph for a long time, listening to the rain outside his window. 2 weeks later, leaving work through a street filled with deep blue evening air, he saw her again. At a corner was a restaurant, with windows that showed candlelight shining on tablecloths and dinnerware. She sat at a table with a man. Butler didn't have a reservation, so they made him wait, then gave him a tiny table behind a pillar. He held his menu unopened, staring at the woman. The man with her had graying hair, sat very straight, and talked in a hard military baritone. Butler couldn't catch the words. He asked the waiter, "Who's the woman in the black dress?" "I'm sorry, sir, even if I knew. Does she come here a lot?" "She and the gentleman." Butler ordered coffee. He was drinking it when the gray-haired man got up, took the woman's hand briefly, and left. The woman sat poking at some bright-colored dessert with a long spoon. Butler went to her table. "Excuse me," he said, and sat down. She looked at him wide-eyed, spoon poised in the dessert. "I spoke to you in a movie house a few weeks ago," he said. "I don't know if you remember." When she didn't answer, he went on. "I'm new in town, and I didn't think I would knew anyone here, but you look exactly like an old friend of mine, down to the smallest detail. Her name was Jean Bellows." "Go away," said the woman. "Even your voice sounds like hers." "I'm not your friend," said the woman. "Go away." He didn't move. He looked into her face, her eyes. She looked steadily back, held a hand up in the air. A man in a tuxedo was at the table in seconds, leaning over her attentively. She talked without taking her eyes off Butler. "This gentleman has lost his table." The man turned his attentiveness on Butler. "Can I help you in some way, sir?" No. He stood up, nodded to the woman, left the restaurant. He didn't pay for his coffee. Across the street from the restaurant was a bar. Butler sat at a table under its blue neon sign, pondering and watching the restaurant. After half an hour, the woman came out and walked quickly down the street. He followed. He didn't know the neighborhoods she led him through. The streets were narrow and dark, except where some coffee house or bar had sidewalk tables. Her dark hair and coat blended with the shadows. She turned onto a climbing street with the moon floating at the end of it. Halfway up the block she turned again, and was gone. Butler walked slowly along an alley that dead-ended at a high wooden fence. There were back doors that looked rotted shut, but when he went closer, one was ajar. He had to stoop under a fire escape ladder to push it open. It creaked. He stood still and listened, but there was no sound, no movement in the darkness beyond. He went in. Faint streetlight glow fell on trash by his feet. The air was stuffy, sour. He got a cigarette lighter out of his pocket. The wavering flame showed a brick-walled room piled with garbage. It looked like a place where bums slept, smelled like an animal's lair. Another doorway led into more darkness. Butler thought he heard a faint sound in there. He tried to walk silently, but trash rustled under his feet. He stuck his head and lighter through the next doorway. It was a bigger room, and the light made shadows at the corners. There was a kind of path through the garbage leading to a third doorway. The lighter burned his thumb, and he let it go out. It was utterly dark. He held his breath. Not far away, someone was walking. Butler cursed silently, waved the lighter in the air to cool it. He took a few steps, stumbled over something, stopped. Then he lit the lighter and tiptoed to the next door. The inner room was very big. He couldn't see walls or ceiling. There was trash, rusted metal, rotted wood piled in all directions. The path went straight ahead into darkness. He followed it, his footsteps echoing. When he saw the woman, he almost dropped the lighter. She was leaning against a wall at the end of the path, her eyes flickering in the flame. She didn't move as he got closer. When he was 5 feet away, she said, "What do you want?" Her voice echoed. He said, "Jean?" "No." "Who are you?" "All you need to know, little man, is to stop following me. I don't like it, and I could hurt you." Butler's lighter burned his thumb again, and he let it go out. "Why did you lead me in here? Why didn't you talk to me on the street?" "I like it in here, and there are people who wouldn't like it if they saw us talking." "Who?" "All you have to know is to stop following me. Stay away from me. Forget you ever saw me. Understand?" "No." A wad of garbage flew into his face. "I'm trying to do you a favor, asshole," she snarled. "But it's okay with me if you want to die." She pushed past him in the dark. He lit the lighter and she spun around, knocking it out of his hand. Following the sound of her steps, he picked his way slowly through the trash. Dim streetlights seemed bright when he reached the outer door. The alley was empty, and she wasn't in sight when he got to the corner. A taxi was coming down the street. He caught it. "Drive around," he told the cabbie. They drove in widening circles, the cabbie telling him about another guy he had picked up looking for his girlfriend. It was 10 minutes before Butler saw her hurrying along the street. He cut the driver's story off with a bill, got out at the end of the block, stood in a doorway waiting for her. Wind had come up, bringing the smell of rain. A sheet of newspaper blew past, but the woman was taking her time. Butler looked around the corner. A black car was double parked halfway down the block, and she was fighting 2 men trying to drag her into it. Butler ran. By the time he got to where the car had been, it was turning the corner. The woman inside. He ran. The car was waiting for a light that turned green as he got close. His cab was behind it. He caught the cab in time to bang on the rear fender. The black car wasn't in a hurry. It coasted into a deluxe part of town, stopped in front of gilt and glass doors with a canopy and red carpet. A doorman helped the woman out. The gray-haired man got out behind her, and she took his arm. Doormen fussed them inside. Other people were arriving. None of them seemed afflicted by poverty. Butler sauntered into a lobby. You would need to pack a lunch to walk across. Music came from somewhere. A tuxedoed man took a look at Butler's clothes and said, "Sorry, sir, private club." "Know the woman that came in here ahead of me? Dark eyes, curly hair, pretty, with an older guy?" "I'm sorry, I can't help you, sir." Rain pattered on the sidewalk, rattled the dry leaves of trees. At the end of an alley was an oil-stained concrete loading bay, standing open. Butler went through a storage room, down bare hallways painted industrial green. Doors led into a dark place with flashing lights, smoke, loud music. Butler pushed through the crowd looking for the woman. He jostled someone. It was the gray-haired man. Up close he had a tanned, polite, arrogant face. A rich man's face. The woman was dancing, sweat glistening on her shoulders and arms. She paid no attention to the athletic blonde man opposite her, or to anything else. When the music stopped, she turned away from the blonde man without a word. She took 2 steps toward Butler before she saw him. Her face got a strange look. She pushed past people to the group the gray-haired man was dominating, said something in his ear. He turned and looked at Butler and smiled. Butler didn't like the smile. He smiled back. The man's eyes were disturbing. The polite sneer didn't change, but there was a savageness, a hatred, and Butler saw this time that his teeth were crooked, rotten, bloody. There was another change, too. The crowded dance hall was gone. The flickering light came from a guttering candle that showed the walls of a tiny, filthy room, and in front of him was not a tall man in a gray suit, but a hag who reached for him with clawed hands. He heard a scream, felt a violent concussion. There was confusion, legs moving, faces staring as he pushed himself off the floor, untangled himself from the woman he had knocked down. He had enough presence of mind to apologize. The woman's boyfriend, eyes dilated with some drug, pushed forward, snarling. Butler was bigger. There was laughter from the crowd. People started dancing again. The tuxedoed man who had stopped Butler in the lobby was pushing through the crowd, a nervous waiter at his side. Butler got a taxi home. Fog had seeped into the streets, and there were halos around the lights. The sidewalk in front of his building was unfamiliar, tunnel-like. He rode the elevator to his floor, still feeling numb and shaken. When he turned on his living room lamp, the woman was sitting on the couch. She wore a raincoat and held a gun. She said, "I told you to stay away from me." Her eyes were shaded from the yellowish light of the lamp. The gun pointed at a spot above Butler's navel. He didn't move or say anything. "Aren't you a little bit scared?" she sneered. Suddenly the gun jumped at him. There was a bang like a door slamming, and hot, acrid smoke brushed his face. He knocked over a chair, trying to get somewhere else, heard the bullet break something behind him. "Why have you been following me?" The gun was like a steel question mark in her hand. "You're Jean Bellows." "I am not Jean Bellows, or whatever you say her name is." Butler tried to catch his breath. "You look like Jean Bellows. You have Jean Bellows' voice. You're Jean Bellows." She was leaning back on the couch now. She shook a lock of hair out of her eyes. Fog made a faint haze in the yellow lamplight. "This Jean Bellows," she said. "What did she look like?" "Like you." "You have pictures?" "Yes." "Show me." "Why?" The gun moved a little, suggesting that he get the pictures. He went to the closet, came toward her with the box. "I'm going to sit next to you. I hope that doesn't make your gun nervous." He sat on the couch, the box between them. She held the gun within easy reach of his vital organs, took the photographs he handed her with her left hand. This is a couple of days before Christmas at school. You just finished your last exam, remember? No. You're standing on the library steps. Where did she get that cheap coat? We were students. We were on financial aid. You got it at the Salvation Army, remember? On Catherine Street, across from the food co-ops. No. This is you having a snowball fight with Larry Fagerstrom and some other people. Remember Larry? He was always trying to pick you up. He's ugly. That's not a good picture of him. See how you managed to look like Rita Hayworth even with snow all over your face? He watched her study the photograph. You really don't remember these, do you? He asked suddenly. She shook her head. He pulled the photograph out of her hand, substituted a new one. This is you and me outside the Del Rio. That night. I think it was that night. We got drunk and had a fight. Did we fight a lot? Yes. This is you sitting on your desk after studying. 4 days for a final. The gun in her hand was relaxing. She was almost holding it on her lap instead of pointing it. Butler balled his fist and hit her in the side of the head, hard. She went over backward, the gun thumping on the carpet, photographs scattering. He grabbed her wrists and yanked her upright. Her body was slack. Her eyes fluttered open and slowly focused. She smiled faintly, dizzily. "Kiss me," she said. He woke up in bed with the woman moaning beside him. Wind was blowing in the trees outside, and thunder muttered heavily. She was covered with sweat, trembling in her sleep. She moaned again, then arched her back and cried out in fear or pain. Butler put his hands on her shoulders. Her body was hot, slick with sweat, tensed hard. He shook her. With a scream, she leapt on him, tearing at his throat. She was amazingly strong. In the second before she woke, she had him on his back, straddling him. Then her hands relaxed and she stared. Sweat ran down her face. "You," she said huskily, and rolled off. He sat up, feeling the place where her hands had been. Thunder sounded, closer now, and tree branches swept in front of the streetlight. "You were having a nightmare," said Butler. She nodded miserably. She huddled under the blankets, shivering as if with fever. "Are you all right?" She didn't say anything, just stared at him out of huge, dark eyes. He touched the side of her face. It was wet and hot. "You turning into a werewolf or something?" he asked. "What's the matter?" She made an effort at a smile. "Allergic reaction," she said with difficulty. "To what?" "Forbidden blood." Suddenly she sat up. Rain had begun to patter against the window. She threw her covers off, eyes wild. "Open!" she rasped. He opened the window, held her when she tried to climb out. Rain drenched them. It seemed to calm her. After a while she crawled back into bed and fell asleep. Butler fell asleep too. When he woke, a little before dawn, she was gone. She came to him a few more times, always at night, always without warning. He would find her in his bed, in the shower, in his armchair. She didn't talk much. She was lustful and violent in bed, and afterwards she would lie dully, staring at nothing. She never told him how she got in. She never told him why she always left an hour before dawn. One night he said, "Have dinner with me tomorrow." "No." "Why not?" "Because we would be seen." "Seen by who?" "Some people." "Who?" She didn't answer. "I'll meet you outside your restaurant," he said. "Tomorrow, when you pull up in that big limo." She took something from her handbag, grabbed a handful of his hair, and pushed the thing against his throat. It was her gun. "Listen," she said. "If you ever speak to me or get near me in public, I'll never come here again. I'll have you crippled. I have friends who would kill you without batting an eye." She took the gun away, put it back in her bag. "If you're good, maybe we can see each other a few more times." "I don't want to see you anymore," he said angrily. But he waited as anxiously as ever for her to come back. For a while she seemed a little less unhappy. She was fascinated by his photographs, especially the ones that contained her. She made him tell the story that went with each one over and over, asking questions about every detail. When they had gone through all the photographs, they would make love. One night when she was putting on her clothes, she said, "I can't come any more." Butler stared at her back. "Why not?" She didn't answer. He twisted her roughly around to face him. She looked dully into his eyes. "Why not?" "They're suspicious. They watch me. I can't come any more." "I'll come to where you are." She shook her head and started dressing again. When she was done, she faced him. "Goodbye," she said. The next day was cold, with an occasional beam of weak sunlight. Butler called his office with some excuse, then took a walk, thinking, hands in the pockets of his overcoat. He was in a run-down neighborhood of cracked sidewalks and vacant industrial buildings when there was someone at his side. Her. "I have to talk to you," she said. She led him to a deserted street lined with warehouses. They stood close to a graffiti-covered wall. She looked up and down the street. "They know," she said. Tires squealed at the corner, and Butler turned in time to see a car careen past, a man leaning out the window and pointing something at him. The thing made noise, and something hit Jean. Then the car was squealing out of sight, and she was lying on the sidewalk, gasping. There were 2 dark spots on the front of her coat. Butler was kneeling over her. She was clutching his hands, rolling her eyes as if she couldn't see. Her face was twisted with pain. "Butler?" she cried out clearly, as if looking for him in the dark. "Yes," he heard himself say. She opened her mouth again, but only blood came out. People were shouting and running and leaning over him, and somebody said they would get the police, and then there was a flashing red light, and by that time she was still and not squeezing his hands anymore, and staring at the sky with her eyes wide open, as if she had never seen a sky before. The policeman made him let go of her and walked him away, took his wallet and put him in the back seat of a car. There was a crowd and an ambulance, and the ambulance men carried away something under a sheet. More police came, and one of them stuck his head in the window of Butler's car, but Butler couldn't hear what he said. They drove Butler downtown, put him in a little room, and took turns asking him questions. He told them a simple story that was almost all true. He had known the dead woman at school by the name of Jean Alexandra Bellows, had lost touch with her when they graduated, met her here a few months ago. She wouldn't tell him anything about herself. He had slept with her a few times. Today she met him on the street. He didn't tell them about her friends, or her fear that she was being watched. It seemed too complicated. The policeman didn't like his story. They were making him tell it for the 10th time when a man stuck his head in the door and said, "She's ready, Lieutenant." "Okay," said the lieutenant. "We want you to identify her before she gets too cold, Mr. McLean. You up to it?" He nodded. They went down metal stairs to a basement hall, into a concrete room with shaded bulbs hanging from a low ceiling. A man pulled a long drawer out of a wall full of drawers. Refrigerated air came from the drawer with a faint sanitary smell. Jean lay in the drawer with a sheet pulled up to her shoulders. Butler felt as cold and far away as she looked. He kept his hands in his pockets. "This the Jean Alexandra Bellows you told us about?" asked the lieutenant. He nodded, not taking his eyes off her. "Okay," said the lieutenant. "Back upstairs." The man rolled the drawer shut. They questioned him for 3 more hours until he could hardly talk anymore. Finally they gave him a form to sign for his wallet, told him not to leave town, and let him go. He got a cab to his apartment. When he switched on the light in his bedroom, she was there, wrapped in the morgue sheet, her skin chalk white, sunken eyes glittering. He stood perfectly still. She came closer. There was dried blood on her lips and cheek. The cold smell of antiseptic still hung around her. She touched his face. Her hand was ice cold. "I want to talk to you," she whispered. He didn't say anything, didn't move. "I'm cold," she said plaintively, softly. After a long while, he said, "Jean?" She shook her head. "Are you alive?" "I am alive. This body is dead." After a long while, she said, "I'm cold, butler." He said, "Who are you?" "I took this body from your old lover last year. It was young and beautiful, and mine was old. I have lived with my sisters for hundreds of years, preying on the bodies of normal people." He could only stare. "I saw her on the street one day, and I wanted her. I introduced myself, pretending to think she was someone else. We became friends. I made myself fascinating to her, an old woman who knew intimately of impossible times and places, and hinted at even more glamorous knowledge. I threw my thoughts to her at night, so that she dreamed of me. One day, when she was visiting me, I drugged her, undressed her, and cut her along the spine, bled a drop of my blood into each cut. So we passed the virus that prepares new bodies for our habitation. For a few days she was sick and stayed home, but then she began to think of me, to desire me. The bridge virus was attacking her brain, blood, and nerves, substituting my DNA for hers, turning her body into a shell for my personality. In a few weeks she was so obsessed with me that it was terrible pain for her to be away, even for a minute, and no wonder. Her brain was becoming my brain, her nerves my nerves, her blood mine. One night, as she lay clutching me, I effected the exchange, flooding her willing body with my mind, displacing her. So this body became mine. He was dizzy, sick. He put his face in his hands and leaned against the wall. When he could pay attention again, she was telling him a strange story. "My sisters had me killed. 1,000 years of inbreeding nurtured the mutation that made us, and it's taboo to mate with outsiders. My sisters still worship the old taboos, especially the man who frightened you at the dance club. She became a man so that we could mate. She is eaten away with age, rotten with it, insanely jealous of anyone who comes near me. Living always apart and touching no one, we have developed many sensitivities. Allergies, you could call them. My sisters smeared their bullets with an animal secretion that turns our blood to poison. They thought that would loose my hold on this body. The bullets flung me away past the limits of the place I have the skill to return from. Blackness took me, and my last thought was that I was dead. Then suddenly I was somewhere bright and warm. It seemed to be noon, and the sun shone on greenery. I looked down at my body. There was no blood or sign of hurt. I'm dead, I kept telling myself. This is a dream. But it wouldn't go away. I was in a huge garden with beds and trellises, and bushes of flowers. For a long time the only sounds were the bees buzzing over the wind, moving the branches of the trees. Finally I heard a long way off a clicking. I went toward it. The garden was very big, but finally the clicking got closer, and I came in sight of an old man leaning over a bush, a pair of hedge clippers in his hand. He was very tall and wore a long, dusty coat or robe. He was so intent on the bush that he didn't notice me, even when I stood a few feet away. He studied every part of the bush with patient concentration, finally snapped off a twig, and then started to study it again. It was strange. I seemed to remember him from somewhere. I was about to speak when he turned and held his hand out to me. There was a mirror in it. In the mirror I was horribly ugly. She shuddered. I screamed. My scream seemed to tear the sunlight. Darkness opened under me, and I fell into a dead, silent place piled with bones that broke under me like dry sticks. I clawed to get out, sank further and further, the bones burying me. I couldn't breathe. My screams made no sound. Then there was a light. I could see an opening floating high above me. The torso of the old man appeared in it, peering down. His hands reached through and scooped me out of the bones. I could breathe again. I was back in the garden. I lay clutching the warm dirt, sobbing. I could hear the clicking of the old man's hedge clippers, a long way off again. And suddenly I remembered who he was. I had been with him in that garden many times. I got up to run to him when something stopped me. A cord hung down in front of me, a silver cord that went up into the sky. I stood for a long time looking at it. Then, reluctantly, I put my hands on it and climbed. I climbed very high. I could see the old man, and around him the garden, and woods, and fields, and little hills. I climbed until the blue sky turned black. Finally, I was in this body again, lying in a place like a tomb, freezing cold. It was a refrigerator where they keep dead bodies. In the basement of some place, I got out and came here to ask you something. A favor. I must go back soon to him. I want you to send my sisters to me. They have forgotten him too, and their long lives are only a burden. Butler drove her to the docks. The night was misty and cold, a few stars shining fuzzily. A pier stretched into the mist. They walked out on it. There were no people. Water murmured and whispered, and the sound of a foghorn came over from far off. At the end of the pier floated the moon, making a silver squiggle on the quiet swells. A little water splashed onto the walkway. The woman dropped the sheet from around her. Her body glowed white in the moonlight. She slipped into the water, and he could see her white arms stroking, swimming toward the moon. When she was almost out of sight, she turned for a moment to look back. Then she turned again, and in a few seconds was gone. The address she had given him was on a narrow street overlooking the city, where high walls enclosed gardens, and you could only see the tops of houses among the trees. The street was quiet, empty. 4 little bottles clinked in his pockets as he walked. She had made a mess of his bathroom, filling them with her blood. He hoped the police didn't come by until he had a chance to clean it up. The garden gate was unlocked. The garden had a gazebo, big flower beds, a flagstone walk. The house was stone, slate-roofed, with 3 stories, gables and French windows. There was no sound but birds singing. Around the side of the house were dark basement windows. He kicked the glass out of one and lowered himself into a brick-walled room. A furnace hissed in the corner. The door of the room was ajar, and from outside it came a noise. The noise stopped, then started again. Someone was banging at a door, rattling it. He stood still, hardly breathing, a bottle ready in his hand. The noise stopped and started, stopped and started. He moved slowly into the passage outside the door. At one end of it, stairs led upward. At the other end was darkness. He edged along the wall. A bolted wooden door was being rattled from the inside. When the rattling stopped, there was a faint whining. He drew the bolt and opened the door. An old woman in a dirty sack dress stood there. Her skin was gray and her hair was greasy and tangled. She shuffled backward. "Don't hurt me," she whined. I'm hungry, and him, I think he's dying." She moved an arm in the direction of a filthy bed with an old man who looked like he had died weeks ago. Butler took a step into the room. The old woman cringed away, squinting her watery eyes at him. "Don't hurt me," she whined. "I'm hungry, and him, I think he's dying." "Who are you?" asked Butler. At the sound of his voice, the old woman stood still. "Who are you?" asked Butler again. She came close to him, clung to his jacket with clawed hands, stared into his face. She stank. Suddenly she screamed, her voice rasping and cracking. "Butler!" she screamed. "Butler, help me! Butler, it's Jean! Help me! Don't you remember? It's Jean! Butler, please!" She clung to him, tried to kiss him on the mouth. He pushed her away. She clawed at him, trying to hold him. "Butler, it's Jean! Butler, help me! They did this to me! He threw her off again, backed out the door, and threw the bolt. There was banging and wailing from the inside, and he could hear his name. He looked at his watch. 12:30. The first one would come any minute. He ran up the stairs. He was shaking. The door at the top of the stairs was heavy and cut off the old woman's wailing when he shut it behind him. Beyond was a wide hallway with the front door at the far end. The floor was dark, polished wood, and floor-length curtains blew out languidly from windows. A darkened sitting room opened on his left, and carpeted stairs went up somewhere. There was a huge gold-framed mirror on the wall. Steps sounded on the flagstones outside. A key went into the front door lock. The door opened, and a woman came in. She was tall and blonde, had slanting green eyes and high cheekbones, looked about 35. She wore a white dress and a white fur jacket, carried packages and a purse. She closed the door before she saw Butler. When she saw him, she became very still. "Who are you?" she asked. He didn't move, didn't speak. The woman put down her things and walked toward him, warily, but without fear. Butler's hands were fumbling with the cap on a little bottle. The woman looked at his hands, stopped walking. He threw the poisoned blood on her. It splattered on her face, made a stark pattern on her clothes. For a second she looked surprised. Then the blood started to hiss and smoke, like acid or red-hot metal. She clawed at herself wildly and fell. She screamed deafeningly. The scream was not human. It shook the house, threw Butler against the wall, made the room dark. The mirror turned into flying shards of glass. There was a smell of burning. Then she lay still, panting like a sick animal. Butler pushed himself off the floor. His hands were trembling so much he could hardly find the other bottles. But he had to. The others would come now. He stood in the corner by the basement door and got the tops off 2 of them. The hallway was dim, as if the sun had gone behind a cloud, and the bottles of blood fizzed and smoked. Then 2 things happened at once. Something flew through the hall window 3 feet from him. Glass shattered, wood splintered, and a man stood there, staring at the hurt woman, his back to Butler. There was a sharp explosion, and the front door blew to bits. Butler splashed blood on the man at the window. He fell on his face without a sound, body twitching and writhing as if his clothes were full of small animals fighting to get out. Smoke poured off him. The one who had blasted the door was flying through the air. Butler caught a glimpse of her black hair and loose sleeves fluttering, her pale, snarling face. Then she had him by the throat, slamming his head into the floor with tremendous strength. He was barely able to dash the 3rd bottle of blood against her hip. She shrieked, and her hand went away. He could feel her thrashing wildly on top of him. There was a tremendous explosion. The wall above Butler came apart. Dust, splinters, and rubble flew. Butler coughed and wiped dust out of his eyes. Sat up with the black-haired woman still on top of him. A man was standing at the top of the staircase. He was tall and straight, had gray hair, a gray suit. Butler watched. A spark twinkled between his eyebrows. The spark flashed out, and there was another terrific explosion. The floor next to Butler turned to dust and flying debris. He could see shattered supporting beams through a 4-foot hole. He got his feet under him and stood up, dragging the black-haired woman so that she was a shield between him and the man. She was unconscious, moaning and trembling. He fumbled in his pocket for the last bottle, tried to hold it, and unscrew the cap with the same hand. The man was coming down the stairs. He came slowly, with dignity, like the guest of honor at a dinner party. He walked around the hole he had blasted in the floor. When he was 6 feet away, Butler said, "Stop." The man stopped and stood looking at Butler. His face was composed, solemn, almost sad. He said, "Where did you get that?" He nodded at the uncapped bottle Butler held by the unconscious woman's face. "Don't get any nearer," said Butler. The man nodded. "Where did you get it?" "Jean gave it to me." "Who?" "The woman you killed." The man thought about that for a second. Then he nodded, his eyes far off. "Ah, Yaxis, he said. We underestimated you. Too bad. And this is your little toy? He looked at Butler again. He said, Yaxis sent you? Butler didn't answer. Where is she now? Butler said, Dead. Yaxis dead and you here. He fixed his eyes on Butler's. Who are you? He whispered. Butler's body began to get numb. He gasped for breath. He tore his eyes away. Stop it, he shouted, or you'll fry like your friends. But the man was gone. In his place was Jean, wearing a loose blue silk gown. She looked alive, beautiful. She held out her hands to him. Butler, she said. He couldn't move, couldn't talk. Butler, help me, she said. Come to me, I need you. I don't want to die. I was wrong. There is something horrible in this place. Please come. Help me to be alive again. A hoarse sound came from Butler's throat. No. Please, before it's too late for me. Butler clung dizzily to the woman he was holding. He felt sick. There was a scream, and suddenly Jean was fighting, struggling against something black and spindly. A rotting skeleton twined its arms and legs around her. Worms writhed in its black eye holes. Maggots wriggled out of its open jaws. Jean screamed. The skeleton fixed its teeth on her face and bit, and the scream turned into a gurgle as bone crunched and blood spurted. Butler screamed and lifted his arm to throw the blood. At that instant Jean and the skeleton were gone, and the man stood there in his gray suit, smiling faintly. You don't like that, he said. That is where Yaxis has gone if she is truly dead. I showed you a true picture of her condition. You don't like truth. Butler breathed hard, didn't answer. We who have beaten that demon, why do you want to destroy us? Why don't you join us? I could teach you. No, said Butler. Never to go down under the earth to be eaten by. No, shouted Butler. No. You don't like truth, said the man. Suddenly he was gone again, and Jean was there. She wore a shimmering golden robe. She put her head back so he could see the line of her throat, untied the robe and let it fall, ran her hands over her body, and stretched. Then she lay on the floor and looked at Butler with sleepy eyes. Come, she whispered. You're not Jean, said Butler. Neither was Yaxis, murmured the woman. The real Jean is the hag downstairs. It is this body you want. I can give it to you. Come. She arched her body and ran her hands over it. When Butler didn't move or speak, she stood up gracefully, walked closer. Her hair was long and thick, and there were flowers in it. I could always appear to you this way, she said softly. Live forever with me, rich and happy. Her voice got even softer. Rest now. You're safe. Jean's here. That's right. Suddenly Butler knew that he was falling asleep, hypnotized by her eyes. The bottle of blood dropped in his hand. The unconscious woman was sliding to the floor. With an effort he looked away from the being that was now Jean, shook himself, pulled the woman back up. He lifted the bottle of blood. The man was in front of him again, standing straight and dignified. Say goodbye, said Butler hoarsely. The man closed his eyes resignedly. Yaxis, revenge, he said. Not revenge, said Butler. She saw something beautiful there. Not skeletons and worms. Something beautiful. She wants you to see it too, in spite of yourselves. The man opened his eyes and looked at Butler. She told you this? Yes. Something beautiful? A garden, she said, and a place where... The man burst out laughing. He laughed for a long time, a strong, hearty laugh. When he had stopped, he said to Butler, She told you that? Something beautiful, you fool, he snarled. You stupid yokel. I have been to the land of death many times, and so has Yaxis. We go there to change bodies. She knows it as well as I do. He threw up a hand as Butler raised the bottle. Wait! Shall I tell you about the land of death, so you'll know where you're sending me, and where you'll soon follow, you pitiful fool? I've been there. I've seen it. His eyes were staring. His voice trembled. It's a wide, empty land that goes on forever. Nothing alive, just ash-gray mud and iron-gray sky with no sun. And when you come there, soon you notice a movement on the horizon. And the personage you saw a few minutes ago comes stalking across the waste, and you can't escape because your feet are buried in the mud, and he eats you, swallows your screams and your blood and bones. I've seen it, unless you know how to get away, to get to another body. Please don't send me there. Please, I'll give you anything. I want to live. I just want to live. The man knelt in front of Butler, his head bowed. Please, he said. Butler threw the blood on him. There was a tremendous flash and explosion, as if lightning had hit the room. Smoke billowed, and Butler couldn't see. The woman he held shuddered and cried out. He let her drop. Something moved rapidly in front of him, blowing the smoke away. As it cleared, he saw the gray-haired man suspended in the air, arms straight out from his sides, spinning as fast as a fan blade. As Butler watched, suddenly it was Jean spinning, then a fat old lady, then shapes and colors of people he didn't recognize, spinning and gone, spinning and gone. A hubbub of voices was in Butler's ears, rising to a roar, to a shriek, rising more and more. He ran, half fell down the stairs to the basement. There was a can of gasoline in the furnace room. He took it, and unbolted the door to the room with the old woman. "Butler," she whimpered. He grabbed her skinny arm, pulled her close to him. "Do you want to die?" he asked her. "Oh, yes, yes," she cackled. "Yes, yes." He dragged her and the gasoline can up the stairs until they were at the door to the upper hall. He stood her against the door, unscrewed the cap, and poured gasoline over the woman, the door, the stairs. The smell of it filled his head. He thrust his cigarette lighter into her hands. "Count to 30. He struggled out of the basement window, ran across the lawn. He made himself close the garden gate casually, walk leisurely to his car. The sun was shining cold through high, thin clouds. A few birds sang. He drove slowly, turned down the hill towards the city. 10 blocks down there was a tiny park with benches, unkempt trees, a few rose bushes. He parked and sat on a bench facing the hill. The park was empty, quiet, sleepy. The bench was almost warm in the weak sunlight. On an untrimmed bush nearby was a single rose, blood red, the last of the season, its petals ready to fall. Butler watched the hill. In a little while, smoke came from a place near the top. The smoke got dark and thick and rose straight into the sky. A few minutes later, fire truck sirens sounded in the distance. They seemed to blend with something else, a long, inhuman wail that faded into the quiet air. The afternoon wore on. In an hour the smoke got less, and after a while it stopped altogether. Butler sat in the long, quiet sunlight. A few birds sang, and a dog barked somewhere down the street. Finally he stirred. "Jean," he murmured. A little wind blew then, and the petals of the rose scattered over him.
I say every house in America should have an electric chair. And every man just once in his life should sit in it, just so that he can feel the power of millions of gallons of electricity flow through his veins. I got an electric chair, that's all I need. You get an electric chair, Sheldon, you don't have to worry about the audience. You get an electric chair, you can tell them anything you want, as long as it's real. You get yourself an electric chair and they'll sit there all night long. Kind of a funny idea, sitting in an electric chair and doing a show. Well, think of the therapeutic value of an electric chair and all the money it is. Yes, an electric chair in every home.
The Electric Chair, a show about horror. ElectricChairShow.com.
An electric chair. Wow.
Warehouseman.